Alright, welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today we'll be making potato gnocchi with chive and dill in Taleggio Cream Sauce from the Italian American Cookbook. And since this is a potato gnocchi, we have to prepare the potatoes to be cooked. And to prepare them, I'm just going to prick them with a fork and put them on a wire rack set over a baking sheet. And while the oven comes up to temperature, I go ahead and grate some Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. We need about 2/3 of a cup of that, and then a little bit more that's going to go into the sauce later on. Now that the oven is up to temperature, I'll put the potatoes in for about an hour and prepare the chives and dill by rinsing them off. Then I'm going to go ahead and chop them so that I can get them ready to go into the gnocchi dough. And for each, we need about a 1/4 cup, so I have a 1/2 cup measure, and I just fill it up halfway with each of the dill and the chives. Next, I prepare the garlic to be chopped by pounding it with the side of a knife, which helps to get the skin off. And then I just chop it up to a fairly even small dice or mince. Next, I go ahead and weigh out the Taleggio cheese. I think that's how you say it. So we need 3 ounces of that, and then I cut it up into smaller pieces to help it melt later on. The recipe doesn't really tell you how you're supposed to prepare the cheese, it just says 3 ounces. Now that the potatoes are done, I take them out. I test their tenderness. They look pretty soft to me. I let the potatoes cool for about 30 minutes before peeling them and spooning them into a fine mesh strainer to basically act as a ricer or a food mill, since I have neither one of those. But if you do have a ricer or a food mill, I'm pretty sure you'll save a lot of time and effort, since pressing the potatoes through the strainer is a lot of work and takes a long time, but it gets the job done if you don't have one of those tools. And periodically, you'll definitely want to scrape the bottom of the strainer because the potatoes like to stick and gather on the underside just like this. And with those leftover potato skins, you could probably fill them with some cheese and sour cream or something like that and make some loaded potato skins. Now I get started making the gnocchi dough by adding the potatoes and potato starch to the bowl of a stand mixer, along with 2 teaspoons of salt, 2 teaspoons of onion powder, the Parmesan cheese, the black pepper, and the flour. I mix it on low speed using the pedal attachment for about a minute until it's just combined. And then I go ahead and add the chives and dill that I chopped up earlier along with the egg, and then mix it on low speed again for about another minute until it's combined again. For this next step, you definitely want to generously flour your work surface because the dough is pretty sticky, as well as flour on top while you roll it out so your hands don't get stuck to it and the dough doesn't get stuck to the work surface. And I go ahead and roll it out to about 1 foot in length and 1 inch in diameter. The specific dimensions aren't that important, but you definitely want your gnocchi to be a similar size so that when you cook them, they cook at a similar rate. And now that I'm done with the first one, I go ahead and do the rest of the dough and end up with 3 logs. Then I use a bench scraper to cut the gnocchi into individual pieces. Again, the size doesn't really matter as long as they're similar. Next, I'm going to lightly flour a baking sheet and transfer all the gnocchi onto it so I can get them in the refrigerator. I let mine go in the refrigerator for about 2.5 hours, but the recipe says at least 1 hour, up to 12 hours. You're going to want to cover them. I forgot to cover them, but I think at 2.5 hours I was fine because they didn't dry out too much. Coming up on that 2.5 hour mark, I get some water onto the stove to boil and I season it liberally with salt. The recipe says to use 4 quarts of water and half a cup of salt. And I get some butter melting in a pot over medium-high heat. And I add the garlic, some salt, as well as some cracked black pepper. Once the garlic is fragrant and golden, I add the cream as well as the creme fraiche. And since the creme fraiche is pretty thick, you'll just want to stir that around until it gets homogenized along with the rest of the ingredients. And once that has reduced to about a third, then we can add the cheese. And then we're going to whisk that until all the cheese is melted. And this is what the sauce looked like when it was done. Now that the water is boiling, I can go ahead and add the gnocchi. And the gnocchi will tell you when it's done when it starts to float. And when the gnocchi is floating, I just use this spider to transfer it into the sauce. And then I repeat that with the remaining gnocchi until all of it is done and cooked. With all the gnocchi done, I can put the pot back over medium-low heat and give it a gentle stir. You don't want to be too rough because you might break up the gnocchi, but I think they're pretty sturdy, so you don't have to be too gentle. And the goal here is just to thicken up the sauce a little bit, so let it come to a simmer and reduce just slightly, and then you're pretty much done. In all, it took me about 5 hours to make this recipe. Like I said earlier, I let my gnocchi rest for about 2.5 hours, but the recipe says you can let it rest for just 1 hour, so you can save a little bit of time there if you need to. I gave it an ingredient availability score of 3 out of 5 because the Taleggio cheese and the potato starch might be a little bit difficult to find, and I gave it a difficulty of 2 out of 5 because making that gnocchi dough and rolling it out might be a little bit difficult for some people. So what did I think of this overall? The first thing I noticed was how super soft the gnocchi is. It's definitely different from any other gnocchi I've had in the past, which I really enjoyed. The sauce is super creamy and well seasoned, and it definitely has a unique cheese flavor from the Taleggio. Taleggio on its own definitely has a unique flavor, but in this sauce it's kind of mellowed down, but you can still taste the unique notes that come with the Taleggio. Overall, the texture is very soft and smooth and creamy, but there are still some crunchy bits from the chives and the dill, mostly from within the gnocchi. I would describe it as a very fancy mac and cheese. The only things that I would kind of wish that this recipe had is maybe a meat. I feel like chicken would go really well with it and add another element of texture to it. But really the sauce will go well on a lot of different pastas, and I feel like the gnocchi will go well with a lot of different sauces. As always, you can go to the blog at therecipeanalyst.com to learn more. Thanks for watching.